fresh grain and the finest pottery here.
Get your baskets. Strong woven reeds.
Watch the alignment of that corner.
Bring up the next sled. We must finish this level by sundown.
2 measures of grain for that pot.
2 measures. I will give you 1.5.
Come on, friend. It is a fair price.
Before we begin tonight, I'd like to ask you something the way I sometimes do. Wherever you are right now, settled in, maybe with the room already dark, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And tell me, if you can, what time it is for you. I like picturing that. All these different places, all these different hours, all of us drifting in our own time zones toward the same kind of quiet. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere very far away, not in distance exactly, but in time. Further back than almost anything we usually talk about. Back before Egypt's pyramids were built. Back before Greece had philosophers, or Rome had roads, or almost any name you've ever heard in the history class existed at all. We're going to a flat, dry stretch of land between 2 rivers, more than 5,000 years ago, to a civilization that did something so ordinary to us now that it's easy to forget how extraordinary it once was. They learned to write things down, and in doing so, almost by accident, they left behind something no civilization before them ever had: a voice. Their own words, in their own language, telling us across more than 5,000 years what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped for, and the stories they told each other before they too went to sleep. So get comfortable. Let's go back to the beginning, or at least to the beginning of what we can actually read. The land between 2 rivers. If you look at a map of the world today, there's a region that often gets overlooked, a stretch of land in what's now part of the Middle East, where 2 rivers run roughly parallel to each other before eventually meeting and flowing into the sea. In ancient times, the land between these 2 rivers had a special quality. Unlike much of the surrounding desert, this land, when properly managed, could be made extraordinarily fertile. The rivers, in certain seasons, would rise and spread across the land, depositing rich soil, the way a long, slow exhale leaves something behind. For people willing to do the work, and it was enormous work, this meant something that at the time was almost revolutionary. The ability to grow more food than you needed just to survive, surplus, extra. It's hard to overstate how much that one fact changed everything that came after. When people no longer needed every single person, every single day, focused purely on finding or growing enough food to survive, something new became possible. Some people could spend their time doing other things: building, organizing, recording, thinking. And slowly, in this land between 2 rivers, something began to take shape that the world had never quite seen before, at least not at this scale: cities. The first cities. Try for a moment to imagine what a city would have meant to someone seeing one for the very first time, not as a visitor from another city, but as someone whose entire understanding of human settlement up to that point was small villages, scattered communities, groups of people who all knew each other by name. Now imagine arriving somewhere different: walls, taller than anything you'd seen before, surrounding an area packed with buildings, not dozens of people, but thousands, streets, markets, strangers, actual strangers, people you'd never met and never would, going about their lives within the same walls as you. And at the center of it all, often a massive structure, a temple, built in layers, rising above everything else, visible from a great distance across the flat land surrounding it. A building whose purpose wasn't to house people, but to represent something larger, a connection between the city and whatever its people believed watched over it from above. These early cities weren't just bigger versions of villages. They were a fundamentally different way of living, one that required things villages never had to think about. How do you organize thousands of strangers? How do you decide who does what work? How do you keep track of who owns what, who owes what, who has paid what? The answer to that last question, it turns out, is where our story really begins. The invention of writing. Here's something that might surprise you. As far as we can tell, writing wasn't invented for poetry. It wasn't invented for stories or prayers or declarations of love. It was invented for accounting. In these early cities, as trade and storage and taxation became more complex, people needed a way to keep track of things, how much grain was stored, where, who had delivered what, who owed what, to whom. At first, this was done with small clay tokens shaped to represent different goods, one shape for a measure of grain, another for an animal, and so on. Over time, instead of just using the tokens themselves, people began pressing marks into soft clay tablets to represent the same information symbols, at first simple and pictorial, gradually becoming more abstract, more stylized, more efficient. And somewhere in that gradual process, so gradual that no single person could have said, today writing was invented, something extraordinary happened. The marks stopped being just records of things. They started being able to represent sounds, words, ideas that had nothing to do with grain or animals at all. This is, as far as we know, the earliest writing system in human history. It's usually called cuneiform, a word that simply refers to the wedge-shaped marks made by pressing a cut reed into soft clay. The tablets were then often dried or baked, which almost by accident meant some of them have survived for thousands of years, buried in the ground, waiting. I find something quietly moving in that. The very first things humans ever wrote down weren't grand declarations or sacred texts or love letters. They were lists, receipts, records of grain and sheep and debts between neighbors, the ordinary business of ordinary lives. And yet, from that ordinary beginning, from ledgers and receipts, came everything else. Once people realized that marks on clay could represent words, it was only a matter of time before someone used those marks not to record what was owed, but to record what was believed, what was imagined, what was feared and hoped and wondered about late at night under a sky full of stars, a world full of gods. To understand the stories that came next, it helps to understand something about how the people of this civilization saw the world around them, because it was, in almost every sense, completely different from how most of us see it today. For the people living in these early cities, the world was not something that simply existed, governed by impersonal forces. It was something that was governed actively, constantly by beings far more powerful than themselves. Beings associated with the sky, the sun, the moon, the rivers, the storms, the fertility of the land itself. These beings weren't distant abstractions. They were understood to be present, in a sense, residents of the cities themselves. Each major city had its own principal deity, with a temple at the city's center understood not merely as a place of worship, but in a very real sense as that deity's home. The temple complex often included not just spaces for ceremonies, but storerooms, workshops, living quarters for priests and workers, functioning in many ways like the household of someone very important who needed to be cared for, fed, and attended to the way you might care for an honored guest who never left. This is a very different way of relating to the unseen than many of us are used to. It wasn't only about belief in the sense of accepting that something exists. It was about relationship, daily, practical, almost domestic. The gods needed to be fed, in a sense, through offerings. They needed to be kept content. through proper ceremony, and in return, it was believed they would continue to do what only they could do. Keep the rivers flowing, the crops growing, the city standing. When something went wrong, a flood, a drought, a defeat in battle, it wasn't understood simply as bad luck or as the result of impersonal natural causes. It was understood as a sign that something, somewhere, in this relationship between people and the powers that governed their world had gone wrong and needed to be set right. I don't share this to suggest that this way of seeing the world was correct. That's not really the point of tonight's story. I share it because I think it helps us understand something important about the stories these people told. Their myths weren't just entertainment the way a story might be today. They were closer to explanations, attempts to make sense of why the world worked the way it did, told in the form of stories about powerful beings doing powerful things for reasons that, if you understood them, might help you understand your own life a little better too. The stories they told their children, among the many things written down in this civilization, some of the most remarkable are stories, myths really, though that word can make them sound smaller than they were to the people who told them. These stories often followed a particular shape. In the beginning, the world is described as being in a kind of formless or chaotic state, sometimes described in different versions as a vast, undifferentiated water or darkness before anything had been separated or shaped. Then, through the actions of one or more of these powerful beings, the world begins to take form. Sky is separated from earth. Order is established where before there was none. And eventually, humans are described as being created often for a specific purpose: to serve, to work, to maintain the world that the gods had shaped so that the gods themselves could be free from that labor. I want to pause here gently and say something important, something I think matters, especially for those of you listening tonight who hold deep and sincere beliefs about how the world truly began. These ancient stories are not being presented here as competing explanations for where we actually come from. They're being shared as exactly what they are: the myths of a particular ancient civilization, a record of how one group of people living more than 5,000 years ago understood and explained their world long before later traditions, including the major faiths followed by billions of people today, describe these things in very different ways. What makes these myths worth knowing about isn't whether they're literally true. It's what they tell us about the people who told them what they valued, what they feared, what kind of relationship they imagined between humans and the forces that shaped the world. In that sense, studying these stories is less like studying a rival explanation and more like reading someone's very old diary, a window into how people thought long ago, even if we don't share their conclusions. And there's one story in particular, one that appears in different forms, not just in this civilization, but in cultures all over the world, including much later in scripture, familiar to billions of people today, that I think is worth spending some time with tonight. A story about a flood, the flood that was remembered everywhere. Among the texts recovered from this civilization is a story describing a great flood, a flood so vast that it was said to cover the world, sent as a consequence of decisions made by the powerful beings who governed the world, with only a small number of survivors, warned in advance, who built the vessel large enough to preserve life through the disaster. If parts of that sound familiar to you, you're not imagining it. Flood stories strikingly similar in their basic shape appear in cultures across the ancient world, separated by enormous distances, with no obvious way for the stories to have spread between them through ordinary contact. This has fascinated scholars and curious people alike for a very long time, and there are a few different ways of thinking about it each interesting in its own way. One possibility is that these stories spread between cultures over very long periods of time through trade, migration, and contact, gradually being retold and reshaped to fit each new culture's own beliefs and language while keeping the same basic core. Another possibility, one that I find quietly moving, is that these stories may reflect something that actually happened in some form in the deep past, a real flood, or perhaps several real floods, in different places, severe enough to leave a lasting impression on the people who survived them, an impression so strong that it was passed down, generation to generation, eventually becoming a story. And for many people, of course, the most meaningful explanation is the one found in their own religious tradition, including, for a great many people listening tonight, the account of a great flood and a righteous survivor described in Scripture, understood not as myth, but as true historical and spiritual reality conveyed through divine revelation. What I find remarkable, regardless of which explanation feels right to you, is simply this. Across an enormous span of time and across cultures that had no contact with each other, the idea of a great flood, a moment when the world was nearly undone by water, survived only by a small number of people who had been warned in advance, appears again and again and again. It's as if this idea, water, judgment, survival, a new beginning, sits somewhere very deep in how humans remember and tell stories about the distant past. Whatever the reason, it's a thread that connects an ancient clay tablet written more than 4,000 years ago to stories still told and believed by billions of people today. How a civilization disappears. For a very long time, many centuries, this civilization flourished. Cities rose, grew, sometimes fought with each other, sometimes merged under larger kingdoms. Writing developed further, spreading to other peoples, other languages, eventually influencing writing systems used by other civilizations that came after. And then slowly, not suddenly, but slowly, over a long period of time, it faded. This is one of the strange things about how civilizations end that's easy to miss if you only think about dramatic collapses. Often, there isn't a single dramatic event. Instead, there's a long, slow shift, political power moving elsewhere, languages gradually changing, cities slowly shrinking as people moved away or as conditions changed, until eventually the language itself was no longer spoken by anyone as their first language. It survived for a while longer in a more limited way, used for religious or scholarly purposes, the way Latin continued to be used long after it stopped being anyone's everyday language, and then eventually it stopped being used at all. The cities themselves, no longer maintained, slowly succumbed to the same forces that affect any abandoned structure anywhere: wind, sand, rain, time. Mud brick walls, and most buildings here were built from mud brick, since stone was scarce in this region, slowly eroded, collapsed, and were covered gradually by the same dry soil that had once made this land so fertile. Within a few centuries of being abandoned, many of these once great cities were no longer recognizable as cities at all. They became mounds low, gently sloping hills, indistinguishable to anyone passing by from the natural landscape around them. And for thousands of years, that's exactly what they were. Hills, just part of the land. The people living nearby, generations later, walking over the same ground where massive temples once stood, where thousands of people once lived, where some of the first writing in human history was first pressed into clay with no idea, none at all, of what lay beneath their feet. In the next part of this story, we'll talk about what happened when, after thousands of years of silence, people finally began digging into these mounds and what they found there. we'll talk about the strange experience of reading words written by someone more than 4,000 years ago for the first time in all that time, and what it might have felt like to be the person who first understood that these marks weren't decoration, but language, a voice reaching forward across an almost unimaginable span of time to anyone patient enough to listen. For now, though, let's leave it here with the cities, slowly settling back into the earth, becoming hills, becoming quiet, carrying their stories with them into the ground, waiting. Sleep well tonight, and if your mind wanders toward those quiet, sand-covered hills somewhere, beneath one of them, words are still waiting. They're not in any hurry. They've already waited thousands of years. They can wait a little longer. Welcome back. When we left off, an entire civilization, cities, temples, the first writing humans ever produced, had quietly settled back into the earth, becoming nothing more than gentle hills on a flat landscape, indistinguishable from the land around them. For thousands of years, that's all they were. Tonight, we pick up the story much later, in a time closer to our own, when people began, almost by accident at first, to dig hills with something underneath. For most of the time, these mounds sat quietly in the landscape. No one thought of them as anything unusual. They were simply part of the terrain, slightly raised areas, sometimes used for grazing, sometimes barely noticed at all. But every so often, something would surface. A fragment of pottery brought up by a plow. A piece of brick, oddly shaped, with strange marks pressed into it, found by someone digging a well or a foundation. Local communities, in some cases, had old names and old stories associated with certain mounds, vague memories passed down of something being there long ago, without anyone really knowing what. It wasn't until a more systematic kind of curiosity arrived, driven by a growing interest in some parts of the world, in the deep past, and a new wealth of resources available to pursue that interest, that people began to dig into these mounds deliberately with the specific goal of finding out what, if anything, was underneath. What they found exceeded almost anyone's expectations. Beneath the surface of these unremarkable hills were the remains of enormous structures, walls, foundations, the bases of towering temple platforms, sometimes still standing several stories high beneath the accumulated soil, entire street layouts. Rooms still containing objects left behind by the people who once used them, tools, jewelry, pottery, and again, tablets. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, eventually, covered in those same wedge-shaped marks that had occasionally surfaced before, but now appearing not as isolated curiosities, but by the basketful. I think it's worth pausing here to imagine what that moment must have felt like. Not the moment of any single discovery, but the gradual dawning realization over months and years of digging that what was being uncovered wasn't just old. It was old in a way that reorganized everything people thought they knew about how old could be. Before this, the oldest written records most people in the wider world were familiar with came from other ancient civilizations, old but with a known place in a known timeline. What was emerging from beneath these mounds was older still, older than anything with a name, older in some cases by more than 1,000 years than texts that had themselves always been considered ancient. It must have felt a little like opening a very old book, expecting to find the first chapter and instead finding an entire library that came before it, a language no one could read. Here's where the story takes a strange turn, because finding the tablets was only the beginning. For a long time, no one could actually read them. The wedge-shaped marks were clearly writing that much was obvious from their consistency, their patterns, the way they were arranged in rows. But writing on its own doesn't tell you anything if you don't know what sounds or words or ideas it's meant to represent. A page covered in a completely unfamiliar script is, for all practical purposes, just a page covered in shapes. The process of changing that, of turning shapes into meaning, is called decipherment, and it's one of the slowest, most painstaking kinds of work that exists. It's not like translating a language you already know how to read, where you simply look up unfamiliar words. It's closer to working backward from nothing, trying to figure out not just what the words mean, but what sounds the symbols even represent in the first place, with no dictionary, no teacher, no living speaker, and often no certainty that it's even possible at all. Decipherment efforts for this script took decades building, piece by piece, on small breakthroughs. Some came from comparing the unfamiliar script to inscriptions that included multiple languages side by side, where a known language could provide clues about an unknown one. Some came from recognizing patterns, names of rulers, for example, that appeared in contexts where their identity could be guessed from other historical sources, allowing scholars to work out which symbols corresponded to which sounds. Slowly, symbol by symbol, sound by sound, the script began to open. And once it did, once scholars could actually read, rather than just look at these tablets, an extraordinary thing happened. The tablets began to speak, not in any mystical sense, simply in the most literal sense possible. Words that had been pressed into clay more than 4,000 years earlier could finally be read by someone for the first time since the person who wrote them had set down their reed and moved on to whatever they did next, what it might have felt like. I want to slow down here, because I think this moment, the moment of first reading something ancient and understanding it, deserves more than just a historical note. It deserves a little imagination. Picture someone more than a century ago now, sitting at a desk, surrounded by tablets, fragments, notes, dictionaries of their own making, years of careful work behind them, and picture them working through a particular tablet, line by line, symbol by symbol, slowly translating it into a language they understand. And as the translation takes shape, they realize they're not looking at a list of grain deliveries or a record of a trade transaction, the kind of thing that makes up the majority of what survives. They're looking at something else, a story, a myth, perhaps, or a hymn, or a letter from one person to another expressing worry, or hope, or grief feelings that until that exact moment had been sealed inside a piece of clay for over 4,000 years, completely inaccessible to anyone, waiting. And now, in this moment, for the first time since it was written, someone understands it again. I think there's something almost overwhelming about that, if you really sit with it. A piece of communication created by a person for some specific reason in some specific moment of their life, sent out into time rather than space, not meant necessarily for anyone in the deep future, just written, set down, and then somehow, despite everything, despite cities crumbling, languages dying, civilizations rising and falling in the time between it arrives, it's received by someone somewhere who was never imagined by the person who wrote it, and who nonetheless understands exactly what they meant. It's a strange kind of message in a bottle, except the bottle wasn't thrown into an ocean, it was thrown into time itself, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, it washed ashore, what we choose to write down. One of the things I find most affecting about these tablets isn't the grand material, the myths, the hymns, the records of kings and temples. It's the small material, the ordinary, human, almost embarrassingly familiar things that occasionally turn up among them. Letters between family members discussing everyday concerns. Complaints, genuine complaints about goods that were promised but never delivered, written with a tone of frustration that translates remarkably well across 4,000 years. Notes between students and teachers. Even in some cases, what appear to be early versions of proverbs, short sayings, observations about life. The kind of thing that gets repeated so often it becomes part of how people think without anyone remembering where it came from. There's something quietly humbling in this. We tend to imagine ancient people as somehow different from us, more mysterious, more remote, concerned with grand cosmic questions in every waking moment, and sometimes in their myths and their temples they were, but in their letters, their complaints, their proverbs, they sound remarkably like us, worried about deliveries, annoyed with each other, trying to pass a little bit of accumulated wisdom on to the next generation in the hope that it might help somehow, even though they'd never know if it did. Across more than 4,000 years, across a civilization, a language, and a way of life, almost entirely unlike anything that exists today. Some things, it turns out, don't change very much at all. What survives and what doesn't? I want to end tonight's part with a thought that stayed with me for a while and that I think fits well with where we are late at night, drifting towards sleep. Of everything that existed in this civilization, every person, every conversation, every meal, every quiet evening, every ordinary day, repeated for thousands of years across countless lives, almost none of it survives. Not because it didn't matter to the people living it, but simply because most of it was never written down, and even what was written down mostly didn't survive the centuries that followed. What we have left is a tiny fraction, a scattering of tablets, mostly records and accounts, with myths and letters and proverbs mixed in almost by chance, not because someone decided these were the important things to preserve, but because these particular pieces of baked clay happened to survive, while countless other things, wooden objects, woven fabric, spoken words, entire lives, simply didn't. And yet, that tiny fraction is enough to tell us that these people dreamed, complained, loved, worried, told stories to their children, and wondered, just as we do, about where the world came from and what waited beyond it. I think there's something both sobering and comforting in that. Sobering because it reminds us how much of any life, any era, simply disappears, leaving no trace at all. But comforting too, because it shows that even a tiny fragment, a handful of clay tablets out of an entire civilization, is enough to carry something real across thousands of years. Enough for someone today, lying in the dark, to feel a quiet sense of connection to people who lived so long ago that almost everything else about them has vanished. Maybe that's worth remembering gently as you drift off tonight. Most of what happens in any life, in your life, in mine, won't be written down, won't be remembered, won't survive in any specific form. And that's all right. It doesn't make it matter less. It just makes it part of the vast, quiet majority of human experience lived fully in its moment, and then, like almost everything else, gently absorbed back into time. What we do leave behind, even a little of it, can still reach forward further than we could ever imagine. As these tablets show us, 4,000 years, and still somehow arriving. Sleep well tonight. And if you find yourself thinking before you drift off about something small, a thought, a feeling, an ordinary moment from your day, let it sit there for a moment gently. It doesn't need to be written down to have mattered. It already has. Welcome back one more time. We've traveled a long way tonight, from the rivers that made these cities possible, to the invention of writing, to the myths people told about their world, to the long silence after these cities disappeared, and finally, to the moment that silence was broken again. Tonight, for this final part, I want to slow down even further and bring everything we've talked about back to something a little closer to home. To you, tonight, listening to this, the names we still use. Here's something small, but I think rather wonderful, a little thread connecting that ancient world directly to your life today in a way you've probably never thought about. Many of the ways we measure time and space, ways so familiar that we never question them, trace back, in part, to the same region and the civilizations that followed it. The division of a circle into 360 degrees, the division of an hour into 60 minutes, and a minute into 60 seconds. These specific numbers, 60, 360, aren't natural laws. They're choices made by people a very long time ago, based on a counting system that worked differently from the one most of the world uses today. So when you check the time tonight, when you glance at the clock before turning off the light, the numbers you see, the way an hour is divided, the way a circle is measured in geometry class, all carry a faint echo of decisions made by people living in those cities between the two rivers thousands of years ago. People who never could have imagined you or your clock or your night, and who, nonetheless, in a quiet and indirect way, are still present in it. I like that. Not because it changes anything practical, but because it's a small, concrete reminder that the past isn't really separate from the present in the way we sometimes imagine. It's underneath the present, built into it, quietly present in things so ordinary we never think to look for it. A civilization of firsts. If you step back and look at everything this civilization is associated with, not as a list of facts, but as a pattern, something interesting emerges. Writing, cities in the fuller sense of organized urban life, codified laws, written rules applied to everyone rather than decided case by case, organized systems of time and measurement, long written narratives, stories told not just around a fire, but recorded, preserved, intended to be read again. None of these things appeared instantly or in isolation. Each grew out of the conditions we talked about earlier: fertile land, cities, the need to record and organize an increasingly complex way of life. But taken together, they represent something genuinely new in human history. The moment when human life started leaving behind a different kind of trace, not just physical remains, bones, tools, structures, which every culture leaves, but textual remains. Words, thoughts, deliberately preserved. Before this, the inner life of humanity, everything people thought, believed, hoped, feared, left almost no direct trace at all. We can infer some of it from physical remains, but we can't read it in any literal sense. After this, for the first time, we can. Imperfectly, fragmentarily, but genuinely. In a sense, this civilization didn't just build cities, it built the first bridge between the inner life of one group of humans and the understanding of people living thousands of years later. That bridge has been rebuilt again and again by every civilization since, but this was where it began. What we don't know, I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters, and because I think it's part of what makes this story feel real rather than neatly packaged. For everything we've learned, and it's an enormous amount, especially compared to a couple of centuries ago, there's far more that we don't know and likely never will. The vast majority of tablets that once existed were never written in a form that survived. Of those that did survive, only a fraction have been excavated. Of those excavated, only a fraction have been translated. The work is slow And there are even now more tablets sitting in storage, waiting to be read, than there are scholars and lifetimes available to read them. And beyond the tablets, there's everything that was never written down at all. The spoken stories, the songs, the everyday conversations, jokes, arguments, quiet moments between people who loved each other, none of it written, none of it preserved, all of it gone. The moment it happened, the way almost everything in every life eventually is. So what we have, this picture of an ancient civilization with its cities and its gods and its myths and its letters, is real, but it's also partial. A sketch drawn from fragments with enormous gaps that we fill as best we can with careful inference and sometimes simply with not knowing. I don't think that should feel discouraging. If anything, I think it should feel like an invitation, a reminder that there's still more out there, still more to find, still more voices from the deep past waiting quietly in storerooms and unexcavated mounds for someone someday to listen. A closing thought. So here's where we end up after everything. More than 5,000 years ago, in a dry, flat land between two rivers, people built cities for the first time. They invented writing almost by accident to keep track of grain and debts. They told each other stories about how the world began and what waited beyond it, stories shaped by their own understanding, different in many ways from the understanding that came later and that billions of people hold today. Their cities rose, flourished for a very long time, and then slowly, over centuries, faded, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually the way most things end. The buildings crumbled, the sand moved in, the hills formed, and for thousands of years, the world simply continued with no idea what lay beneath those quiet, unremarkable mounds. And then, finally, recently, in the grand scheme of things, people dug and found, and after a long process of careful, patient work, learned to read again what had been silent for so long. What strikes me most, thinking about all of this tonight, isn't really any single fact. It's the shape of the whole story. Beginning, flourishing, fading, silence, and then, against every reasonable expectation, a kind of return, not of the people who are long gone, but of their voices, faintly, carefully reconstructed, reaching across a almost unimaginable span of time to arrive here. Now, with you, there's something in that shape, beginning, fading, silence, return, that I think applies to more than just ancient civilizations. It's the shape of a lot of things. Days, relationships, even in its own way, a single night's sleep drifting away from waking thought into something quieter, something further from the surface, and then eventually returning again, carrying with you whatever settled during that quiet time. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, I hope some small part of this story stays with you, not as something to remember exactly, but just as a quiet presence. Somewhere beneath a stretch of dry land on the other side of the world, there's still tablets that haven't been read, still words waiting, not in any hurry. They've waited this long, they can wait a little longer. And somewhere, right now, in whatever country you're listening from, your own ordinary day is quietly becoming part of the past too. Most of it won't be written down, and that's all right. It still happened. It still mattered. The way all those ordinary days, all those ordinary lives in that ancient land between two rivers still mattered, even though almost all of it is gone, and only the smallest fragments remain. Sleep well tonight. Sleep well tonight. But not quite yet. Not entirely. There is still more to say, more threads to follow before the quiet comes, Part 2, what the tablets kept, the voices that survived everything. Let me take you back one more time to that desk, to that scholar sitting with fragments of clay in lamplight, perhaps late at night, not so different from where you are right now. They are translating a tablet found in the rubble of a city that no longer exists, that hasn't existed for thousands of years. And as the words take shape in a language they understand, something happens that is almost impossible to fully describe. The person who wrote this pressed these marks into wet clay with a cut reed on some ordinary afternoon thousands of years ago. That person could not have imagined that anyone would ever read it again. They wrote for their own reasons, their own moment, their own life. And yet, here it is, arriving. This is what I want to explore. In this final part, not just what the tablets say, but what it means that they say anything at all. What it means that words can outlast empire and languages and the people who spoke them and still arrive. The oldest love poem, Someone Was Lonely, 4,000 years ago. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from these ancient cities, there is one that is sometimes described as the oldest love poem in human history. I won't quote it because it isn't mine to quote, and because the exact words matter less than what the existence of it means. Someone more than 4,000 years ago sat down with clay and a reed and wrote something that expressed tenderness, longing, the specific feeling of caring about another person deeply enough to want to say so in words, not a list of grain, not a record of debts, not a myth about how the world began, just a feeling written down because the person having it needed in some way to put it somewhere outside themselves. This is one of the most human things I know of, the need to externalize what we feel inside, to press it into a medium that might outlast the moment. And it did. This particular feeling pressed into clay more than 4,000 years ago has outlasted absolutely everything else about that person. We don't know their name. We don't know their face. We don't know what happened to them or who they loved or whether it worked out. But we know they felt something strong enough to write down, and that is more than most of us will ever leave behind. The scribes, the people who made it all possible. There is a class of people in this ancient world who are easy to overlook because their work was largely invisible. In the grand sense, the scribes, the people who actually pressed the marks into the clay day after day, recording grain deliveries and trade transactions and temple accounts, and occasionally a story, or a letter, or a proverb. Being a scribe was a profession learned through years of study, beginning as children, attending schools, called in the language of this civilization by a name that translates roughly as the tablet house. The curriculum has been partially reconstructed from tablets found at the school sites themselves. Students copied texts again and again, standard phrases, common words, lists of plants, lists of animals, lists of stones, lists of gods, all committed to memory through repetition, the way students everywhere have always learned through the tedium of practice until the knowledge becomes automatic. And sometimes among the student tablets, you find something that is not a list or a copied text, something smaller, more personal, the equivalent of a doodle. In the margin, a small drawing on the back of an exercise, a joke in a practice text, a student somewhere having a moment of not paying attention and doing what students have always done, something else, something their own, 4,000 years. And students still do something else when they should be studying what the kings wanted to remember and what they wanted everyone else to forget. Among the most abundant of the tablet records are the records of kings, rulers of these ancient cities, left behind extensive accounts of themselves, what they built, what they conquered, what gifts they gave to the temples, what the gods apparently said to them in dreams. These records are fascinating for what they contain, but perhaps equally fascinating for what they don't. No king in these ancient records lost a battle they didn't win. No king suffered a defeat they couldn't explain as something intentional on the part of the gods, a test or a temporary reversal that would soon be overcome. Victory was recorded carefully. Defeat was either reframed or simply not written down. And this, too, is extraordinarily familiar. The human tendency to record what reflects well and to quietly not record what doesn't. History, even now, is still shaped by who controls the account, by what gets written down, and what gets left out by the instinct to make the record somewhat better than the reality. 4,000 years. And this, too, has not changed. The mythology of everything, how stories explained what nothing else could. Let me spend a little more time on the stories these people told, because I think they deserve it. Not the specific details, not the names of the gods, but the shape of what the stories were doing. In a world without the accumulated knowledge that we now have about why things happen the way they do, the question why is the hardest question a person can ask. Why does the river flood this year, but not last year? Why does the harvest fail? When we did everything right, why does someone die? Young, when everything seemed fine, why does something terrible happen to people who did nothing to deserve it? These questions don't have simple answers. Even now, even with everything, we know the randomness of suffering, the unpredictability of the world. These remain among the hardest things about being alive. For the people of this ancient civilization, one way of living with these questions was to frame them as something other than randomness. The world was governed by beings with intentions, with reasons. Sometimes those reasons were unknowable, but they existed, and that meant the world was not simply random. There is a kind of comfort in that, even if the explanation is not correct, in any literal sense, there is a kind of comfort in believing that what happens to you happens for a reason, even a reason you don't understand. This instinct toward meaning, toward explanation, toward the idea that the universe is not indifferent, has never left us. It appears in every human culture, in every era, in every language, in one form or another. The forms change, the language changes, the specific stories change, but the underlying need, the need for the world to mean something, for what happens, to matter in some larger sense, that has not changed. Not in 4,000 years, not in any number of years that we have any record of. The language that died and left behind only sounds. The language of this civilization is no longer spoken by anyone as their first language. It hasn't been for more than 2,000 years. It died gradually, the way languages always die, not suddenly, not in a single moment, but slowly, as the people who spoke it as their everyday tongue became fewer, as other languages spread and became more useful, more necessary, more associated with power and trade and opportunity, and as a language stops being what children learn at home from their parents, something begins to disappear. That can never fully be replaced. A language is not just a set of words and grammatical rules. It's a way of seeing things. Certain ideas exist in one language that don't quite exist in another. Ways of framing the world, specific sounds that feel like certain feelings. To the people who grew up hearing them, when a language dies, that specific way of experiencing reality goes with it, partially, incompletely, but really gone. Linguists have reconstructed a great deal of how this language worked, enough to read. Most of what was written in it with reasonable confidence, but the sound of it, the way it felt in the mouth of someone who grew up speaking it, the specific music of it in conversation, in argument, in a lullaby, sung to a child, in the dark that is gone entirely and will remain gone, no matter how much we learn about everything else. The cities that remembered themselves, names that traveled through time. Here is something that I find quietly remarkable. Some of the cities of this ancient civilization are mentioned in texts that billions of people read today, in scripture, in sacred texts, in the stories that have shaped so much of human history, not as old ruins, not as archaeological curiosities, but as real places that were remembered long after they faded, carried forward in the memory of other peoples, other traditions who had known them or known of them or had ancestors who came from them or passed through them. The name of one city in particular appears in texts that are still read every day by people on every continent. A city that was one of the most powerful in the ancient world, whose name has been spoken continuously in one context or another for thousands of years. I won't say the name because the point isn't the specific city. The point is what the persistence of a name means. Anam carried forward through one tradition and another for thousands of years is a kind of survival, not of the place itself, which is rubble and sand, but of the idea of it, the memory, the significance, the fact that once it mattered enormously to someone, cities, but the idea of a city can sometimes outlast almost everything. The long chain, how knowledge passed from one world to the next, the civilization we've been talking about tonight did not exist in isolation. It was in contact through trade, through war, through diplomacy, through migration with other peoples, other cultures, other ways of seeing things. And as it flourished and as it eventually declined, the things it had invented or developed or discovered didn't simply disappear. With it, they traveled along trade routes in the heads of merchants and diplomats and refugees and curious travelers. They were absorbed into other traditions, sometimes recognizably, sometimes transformed almost beyond recognition, but present. The writing system influenced other writing systems which influenced others, until somewhere in that long chain of influence and adaptation came the script that eventually became the alphabet that spread through so much of the world, that underlies most of the written languages. You are likely familiar with the mathematics, the base 60 counting, the 60-second minute, the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, passed through Greek mathematics, then through the Islamic scholars of the medieval period who preserved and extended and passed on so much of the ancient world's knowledge when much of it would otherwise have been lost. Then through the European tradition until it arrived where it is now, in every clock, on every wall, in every geometry class, in every part of the world, every link in that chain was a person or a group of people who decided that this was worth keeping, worth passing on, worth the effort of learning and teaching and preserving. We don't know most of their names. They didn't know that they were links in a chain that would stretch for thousands of years. They just did the work that was in front of them and handed it forward. The way you hand something to the person beside you without knowing where it will end up, the things that didn't survive a quiet acknowledgement. I want to spend a moment with what is absent, because for everything we have, for every tablet, in every museum, for every myth reconstructed, every proverb translated, every letter read, for the first time in 4,000 years, there is an enormous weight of things that didn't make it. Most of the tablets that were ever created are gone, dissolved back into clay or broken into fragments, too small to reconstruct, or buried under sites that have never been excavated, or excavated but not yet read, sitting in storage in a museum somewhere waiting for a scholar who has not yet arrived, and beyond the tablets, everything that was never written down at all. The songs people sang while they worked, the jokes they told each other, the specific way a certain person laughed, the dreams they had and told to whoever was beside them when they woke. None of that survived, not a fragment of it, not an echo, not even a shape. It simply happened, and then it was gone, the way almost everything that ever happens is gone almost immediately, leaving no trace at all. I think about this sometimes, not sadly, just honestly. The preserved and the lost exist together, always. What we have is not the full picture. It never is. It's just the fragment that survived against the odds, the small piece that happened to be in the right form, in the right place, when everything else disappeared. And even that fragment is enough to tell us something real about who these people were, something true across 4,000 years of separation. The astronomers of ancient nights, they looked up to, among the tablets found in these ancient cities, are astronomical records, observations of the sky made systematically over long periods of time. These people looked up at the same sky. You can see tonight the same moon, the same planets moving against the same background of stars. They didn't have the understanding we have now of what those objects are, or how far away they are, or what governs their movements, but they watched carefully over centuries, noting when certain planets appeared in certain position, what happened when they did, whether the patterns they observed could be predicted, used. This watching, this patient, systematic, careful watching of the sky, night after night, year after year, generation after generation, was one of the foundations of what eventually became astronomy, became mathematics, became, in the very long run, the capacity to send instruments into space, to look back at the Earth from above. Everything in that long chain began with someone standing outside at night, writing down what they saw in the sky on a clay tablet in a language nobody speaks anymore, in a city that is now sent, the school lesson that survived 4,000 years of being a student. Let me tell you about one particular tablet found at what was apparently a school in one of these ancient cities. It's a student's exercise. We can tell from the handwriting, tentative, slightly uneven, not the confident marks of an experienced scribe, but the careful, deliberate strokes of someone still learning, still uncertain of each mark before making it. On one side, the assigned text, copied carefully as practice. On the other side, something different, a small drawing of an animal made in the clay with a fingertip, not a reed. a personalmark in a quiet moment when the teacher was looking elsewhere. A student 4,000 years ago did the thing that students have always done, took a quiet moment of not paying attention to do something for themselves, something small, personal, unrequested, and that small thing survived when so much else didn't. The assigned text was preserved because it was careful, correct, part of a tradition worth keeping, but the drawing on the back was preserved simply because it was there on the same tablet by accident, by the randomness of what survives. And what doesn't, I think, about that student, sometimes whoever they were, they had no idea that their small distraction, their quiet, personal, unimportant drawing would be the thing that someone thousands of years later would find most moving. The patience of clay, a material that outlasted everything it described. Here is something worth thinking about as you drift towards sleep tonight. The medium in which all of this was recorded was clay, not paper, not wood, not any of the materials that most civilizations through most of history have used to write things down. Clay, wet and workable, when pressed, holding the impression of the reed as it dried, becoming harder, more permanent, and sometimes when it was fired in a kiln or in the heat of a burning building, becoming essentially permanent, the very thing that destroyed some of these cities. The fires that burning buildings create preserved the tablets inside them, made them harder, more durable, more resistant to the thousands of years of burial that followed. There is something in that I keep returning to. The fires that ended these cities also saved what we know about them, the destruction carried inside it, the preservation, the catastrophe, and the archive were the same event. I don't know what to make of that exactly. I just know that it seems true of more than just ancient clay tablets, that sometimes the thing that breaks something also preserves something of it in a form that nothing else would have. The long silence between then and now, what we cross just by listening tonight without meaning to. You have crossed something, not a distance, in the way we usually mean, not miles or kilometers, a distance in time, more than 5,000 years, between the first marks pressed into clay in the cities between the rivers. And this moment, you somewhere in the dark, listening, that distance is real. It is vast by almost any measure of how humans experience time, and yet something crossed it, not the clay itself, which is in museums and storage rooms and archaeological sites far from where you are, but what was on it, the ideas, the stories, the shape of how people thought about their world, carried forward through one tradition and another, through one language and another, through one scholar and another, until it arrived here in this story On this night, in this room, the chain of transmission that brought it here is not a single line. It is a network, thousands of threads, each one someone who thought this was worth keeping, worth passing on. You are at the end of that network tonight, or not the end, perhaps not the end. Perhaps you'll tell someone tomorrow something small, something you're thinking about, a question, a story, an image that someone might carry forward in their own way, in their own time, without knowing where it came from. And the chain continues. The return to now, what this moment contains. I want to bring you all the way back before we let the silence come back to where you are. The specific room, the specific time, the specific ordinary, particular, unrepeatable moment of your actual life. 5,000 years ago, someone pressed marks into clay to record something that mattered to them. In their moment, you are right now living your own moment that will, from the perspective of everything that follows, be a very long time ago. The specific thing you thought about today, the specific feeling you had before you turned the light off, the particular quality of this specific night, almost none of it will survive in any direct form. And that is not a tragedy. It is simply the condition of living in a present moment that is always becoming the past. But here is what the tablets teach. If anything, even a fragment, even the smallest piece of a person's inner life, accidentally preserved, can reach forward further than anyone, intended further than anyone, imagined possible, and it arrives not as something grand or official or carefully curated, but as something real, a complaint about a delivery that never came, a drawing on the back of a student exercise, a feeling pressed into clay 4,000 years ago by someone who just needed to put it somewhere outside themselves. These things are what the tablets actually contain, not monuments, not declaration, not the official record of great events, just people being people in their moment, the way you are right now, in yours, the sleep sequence, the long quiet at the end of a long story. And now the story settles, the way clay settles, when the water is slowly absorbed and the material becomes itself somewhere on the other side of the world, beneath the quiet hill. There are tablets that have not been found yet, waiting in the dark, in the cold, in the dry soil that has preserved them without meaning to. They have been waiting for 4,000 years. They can wait a little longer. Let your breathing find its pace, the slow pace, the pace of things that don't need to hurry, because they have already waited long enough. The marks in the clay don't change. While they wait, they stay exactly as they were the moment they dried. Patient, in a way, nothing alive can be breathed in the way a reed is lifted before it touches the clay. A Pause between one mark and the next and out, the way the reed lifts again, leaving the impression behind, moving on to the next moment. The ancient cities are sand now, and broken brick, and the occasional shard of pottery surfacing in a plowed field. The rivers still run, not quite where they did. Channels shift over thousands of years. Landscapes change, but water still flows toward the sea the way it always has. The stars that the ancient astronomers recorded on their tablets are still there. Above you, right now, the same stars in the same positions relative to each other that they were when someone in a city that is now a hill looked up and wrote down what they saw. They are above you right now, whether you can see them or not. The student who drew the animal on the back of the exercise in a quiet moment 4,000 years ago did not know that the drawing would survive, did not think about the drawing surviving, just drew in a quiet moment because the moment was there and the clay was there and the hand knew what to do. Your quiet moment is here right now. You don't need to record it. It doesn't need to survive. It is enough for it to be what it is right now, a person in a specific place at a specific time, drifting towards sleep at the end of a day that mattered in the particular unrepeatable way that all days matter. While they're happening, the tablets will be in the museums and the storage rooms tomorrow, and the hill will be a hill, and the rivers will run where they run, and somewhere in a quiet room on the other side of the world, a scholar will sit down with a fragment they haven't read yet and begin the slow, patient work of trying to understand what it says. But that's tomorrow. Right now, there is just this. You're breathing the quiet of the room, the particular darkness that is your darkness tonight. And somewhere beneath a quiet hill, something is waiting patiently as it has always waited, not in any hurry. Having already waited this long, sleep now. The words will still be there. In the morning, sleep. The clay is patient. Sleep. The river still runs. Sleep. The stars are where they've always been. Sleep. The student's drawing is in the museum where it has been for 100 years since someone found it and understood what it was. Sleep. Your day is already becoming the past, and that's all right. That's exactly how it's supposed to be. The past is patient. It keeps what it keeps without effort, without intention, just by being what it is, and you are already drifting into the quiet place where the day stops mattering in the way it did just a few minutes ago, where the story settles into something softer than a story, just a feeling of having been somewhere a long time ago and come back, a little changed, the way you always do when you've really been somewhere. Sleep. The clay is patient. The river runs The stars are still there, and you are already almost gone, but not entirely, never entirely. Something always remains. Atratse, the way a reed leaves its impression in the clay long after the hand that held it has gone still. Part 3. The things we carry without knowing, what travels with us through the dark. There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't live in books or tablets or any written thing. It lives in the body, in the hands, in the particular way a person does something that they learned from someone who learned it, from someone else who cannot be named anymore, who exists now only in the doing of the thing. Think about the way you learned to tie something or make something or do something with your hands that someone showed you, not explained, showed hand over hand, the knowledge passing through touch, through demonstration, through the patient repetition of doing it wrong, and then less wrong, and then almost right, and then one day, without noticing, right. That knowledge came from somewhere. It always comes from somewhere, and the chain that connects you to its origin is longer than you will ever know. The way you hold certain things, the way you approach certain tasks, the gestures that feel natural, that feel like your own, were not always yours. They arrived through someone who arrived through someone else, all the way back through generations of people, teaching people who taught people in a line so long it disappears into the part of the past that left no record at all, only the doing still being done, the hands that taught the hands. Knowledge without words. In the ancient cities, between the rivers, not everything was written down. Most things were not the way a boat was built, the way bread was made, the specific pressure of a hand on wet clay to make it do what you wanted, the knowledge of which plants were good, in which season, from which part of the riverbank. None of this was on the tablets. It was in the hands, in the bodies, in the accumulated experience of people who had been doing this for generations before the first tablet was ever pressed. And this knowledge, the embodied kind, the kind that lives in practice, not in records, is in some ways the most fragile, because when the person who carries it is gone, it can simply stop without ceremony, without anyone noticing, until someone tries to do the thing and fins, they don't know how, and nobody can tell them, because the last person who knew did not pass it on, for whatever reason, was too busy, or thought there would be time, or assumed someone else already knew, and now it is gone in a way that even the burned city was not, because the city left rubble, left tablets, left something that could be found and read, but the knowledge in the hands left nothing, nothing at all, just an absence that you can only see if you know to look for it. The ordinary day that left no trace, what most of life was, here is what the tablets don't contain, and never could. The sound of the market. In the morning, when everyone arrived at once with their different things to trade, and the noise was enormous and specific and completely ordinary to everyone who heard it every day for their whole lives. The smell of the river in a particular season, the specific quality of the light on a late afternoon in the flat land between the rivers, when the shadows were very long and everything turned a color that had no name, but that everyone knew. The feeling of being tired at the end of a day that was like every other day, and lying down is anywhere. It happened billions of times across thousands of years in those ancient cities, and it left no trace, except this, the knowledge that it happened, the certainty that it must have happened, because people were people, and people have ordinary days, have mornings and evenings, and the feeling of being tired and the relief of rest, and it was all real as anything that survived, maybe more real, because it was what most of life actually was. Not the great events, not the records, not the things worth writing down, just the ordinary texture of being alive on an ordinary day that no one thought was worth recording, because tomorrow would be the same. The child who grew up near the river, an imagined life rooted in what we know. Let me imagine for a moment a child growing up near the river in one of these ancient cities, not a king's child, not a scribe's child, just a child whose family did something with their hands to live. This child woke up every morning in a specific room with specific sounds. The river somewhere nearby, the sound of the household, beginning the day, the smell of something being prepared before anything else. This child had a favorite place. Everyone does. Some corner, some view, some spot that felt more like them than anywhere else. Maybe by the water, maybe on a rooftop where you could see further than usual and feel for a moment that you could see everything. This child was afraid of something. Everyone is afraid of something. Maybe the dark, maybe a particular sound. The river at night, when it moved differently, made sounds. That felt like something that had intentions. This child loved something, the way children love things, with a completeness that adults rarely manage. Some animal, some game, some person who made the world feel safer just by being in it. This child grew up, became someone, did the thing to another several hundred miles away, might take weeks or months to arrive, if it arrived at all. And the person who wrote it didn't know, when they sealed it in its clay envelope, whether the person carrying it would make it, whether the recipient would still be in the same place, would still be alive, would ever read these words. They wrote anyway. They said what they needed to say, knowing that by the time the words arrived, everything might have changed, that the situation they were describing might be resolved, or worse, or completely different in ways they couldn't predict. And this too is extraordinarily familiar. The experience of saying something into the future, not knowing who will receive it, or when, or in what circumstances. Every letter ever written is a small act of faith in the existence of a future moment in which someone on the other end is real and present and ready to receive. What you are sending, the tablets, are that faith materialized. They are letters to us that the writers didn't know they were writing, sent without intention, across a distance so vast that the word distance barely covers it, arriving here in this moment, in this room where you are, almost asleep, the mathematics of the night sky, numbers that outlasted everything. The ancient astronomers did not know what the stars were, not in the way we know. They did not know. They were looking at other suns unimaginably far away. They thought, in many cases, that they were something else, lights in the kind of ceiling, or beings with intentions, or fires of some kind that burned for reasons connected to the lives of people down here, below, but they counted them carefully. They noted their positions, their movements, the patterns they made over the course of a night, over the course of a year, over the course of many years. They built systems for organizing what they saw, for predicting what would happen when in the sky above them. And these systems were not perfect. They contained errors, misunderstandings, ways of framing things that later turned out to be incorrect, but they were systematic. They were careful. They were the beginning of something that eventually became the capacity to understand what the stars actually are, how far away they actually are, what the universe actually looks like on the largest scales anyone has ever tried to imagine. This chain from the ancient astronomer with a tablet under a clear sky in a city that is now sand to the modern observatory with its instruments that can see billions of light years in every direction is not a metaphor. It is a real chain of real people, age one, building on what came before, age one, making it possible for the next to go further, to see more, to understand something that the one before could not. And it started with someone looking up on an ordinary night and thinking, this is worth writing down the feeling of ending, what completion meant then and now. Every story needs a place to rest, even the ancient ones, even the myths that seem to go on forever and ever, cycling through the same events, the same gods, the same battles, the same deaths and returns. Even those had a place where the teller could put them down for the night, a resting point, if not an ending. The ancient stories were often circular. They didn't end the way we think of endings now. They returned to something like a beginning. The hero back home, the god back in the sky, the world restored to something like what it was before the story began, but changed in ways that the story made possible. And the people who listened, who gathered in whatever space was used for the telling, went home after in the dark with something they didn't have before, not information, not instruction, just a feeling that the world was larger than it was before the story, and that they were part of it in some way that was worth something, that meant something, even if they couldn't quite say what. This feeling is not unique to any culture or any era or any form of story. It is what stories have always done when they work the way they're supposed to work, made the world larger from the inside without moving a single step. The weight of what was saved and what saving costs, the tablets that survived were saved by people who thought they were worth saving, not always for the right reasons, not always with the right instincts about what was valuable and what wasn't. Sometimes the most important things were saved by accident. The student's drawing, the complaint about the bad copper, the oldest love poem, not because anyone knew their importance, but because they were on the same tablet as something else. And the whole tablet was kept, and sometimes things that were carefully preserved. That seemed enormously important to the people who kept them, turned out to matter less than the things kept accidentally beside them. This is still true. We are still in the middle of this process right now, deciding through the aggregate of millions of small decisions what gets kept, what gets passed on, what is worth the effort of carrying forward. And we don't know which of those decisions will turn out to matter. We can't know, not yet, not from inside. The moment, the archive always looks different from the outside than it did from within. What seems important now may not be. What seems trivial now might be everything to someone in the future we can't see. And so we keep what we can. We pass on what seems worth passing, and we trust that somewhere in all of that, something real, something true, something that matters will make it through the way it always has, the way it somehow always does. The archaeologist's moment, when the past becomes present, there is a moment that every archaeologist describes in one way or another when they find something that has not been touched since it was last placed there by human hands thousands of years ago. A moment when the gap between then and now suddenly disappears because the object is right there in front of them, real, particular, specific, not an abstraction, not a historical fact, but a thing that someone made or used or touched or dropped. And here it is, still here, after everything, still here. The description of this moment sounds the same, no matter who gives it, no matter where they were or what they found. Something shifts, something becomes suddenly real In a way, it wasn't. Before, even for people who have done this many times before, who knew intellectually that this is what the work was about, even for them, the moment arrive and changes something, you are having a version of that moment right now, not with an object in your hands, but with a story in your mind, something from very far away, arriving here, feeling suddenly real, the river at night, what the water knew, the river at night is different from the river. In the day, everyone who has lived near a river knows this. The sound changes. The quality of the movement changes. Something that was ordinary in daylight becomes something else. In the dark, more present, more audible, more like something with its own intentions. The ancient people who lived near these rivers knew this too. The river at night was different, was something you listened to differently, moved around differently, thought about differently. And the river continues, not the same river. Rivers change course over thousands of years. The channels shift, the banks move. What was water is now land. What was land is now underwater, but water still flows through that landscape, still finds its way toward the sea, still moves at night, making sounds that people who live near it learn to read without thinking. The way you learn to read the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough, the river is still there, still running in the landscape where those cities were. And if you stood on its bank at night and listened, the sound would be what it has always been: water moving over and around what's in its way, patient, persistent, indifferent to the centuries, piling up on either side of it the name you don't know you carry. Inheritance without records, your name, if you have one, from a tradition older than your grandparents, may carry within it something from a language that was already ancient. When the first cities between the rivers were being built, names travel the way words travel through one language and another, changing their shape a little each time, but carrying something of what they were. The way a river carries sediment from far upstream, depositing it far downstream long after the place it came from has been forgotten. You carry things without knowing. This is always true of everyone. The specific combination of features in your face came from somewhere, many somewheres. H1, a person who lived and died and passed something forward without knowing. They were passing it just by living, just by having children who had children who had children, all the way down to you lying here in the dark at the end of a day that they could not have imagined any more than you can fully imagine them. You are the arrival point of thousands of years of people living their ordinary lives, making their ordinary choices, having their ordinary days. That felt extraordinary. From the inside, the way yours do, from yours the fragment. That means the most, not what we expected to find. If you had asked the archaeologists before they began what they most hoped to find in the ancient cities between the rivers, they probably would not have said a student's drawing on the back of an exercise. They would have said a great myth, previously unknown, a historical record that confirmed something long debated, a religious text that explained something about how these people understood the world. But what stops people in their tracks? What makes the scholars pause and feel something that is hard to name is not usually the monumental. It is usually the small, the specific, the accidentally preserved glimpse of a person being a person, the drawing on the back of the exercise, the complaint about the copper, the love poem that was never meant to be literature, just a feeling written down because it needed to go somewhere outside the person who was having it. These are the things that reach forward most powerfully, not because they are great, but because they are recognizable, because they close the gap between then and now in a way that nothing grand quite manages. You can admire a great monument from a distance, but a drawing of an animal on the back of a homework tablet that reaches in and touches something that has no distance at all. The long tradition of listening in the dark, stories told at night across all of time. Humans have always told stories at night. This is one of the oldest things we know about ourselves. Before writing, before cities, before anything that we might call civilization, people gathered in the dark and someone told a story and the others listened and something happened. In the listening, something that was needed, that the day with its practical demands, its necessary tasks, its forward motion didn't allow for the night, allowed for it, the dark and the warmth and the voice and the story were the conditions in which something could happen that needed to happen. Something like the day being processed, the world being made larger from the inside, the self being reminded that it was part of something that didn't begin with it and wouldn't end with it, that the particular difficulties and confusion of this specific day were not the whole of things, were not the measure of everything, were just today, which would become yesterday, which would become last year, which would become history, which would become eventually one of those ordinary days that left no trace, but that was real while it was happening, as real as any day that ever happened to anyone, anywhere. This story is part of that tradition, the one that started before writing, before cities, before any record we could ever find, and you are part of it right now, lying in the dark, listening the way people have always lain in the dark and listened in every language that has ever been spoken, in every place that people have ever called home, the thing that will outlast you, and the thing that won't, most of you, will not be remembered. This is not sad. It is simply the condition of being human in a world where there are and have been many humans. Most of us leave no record. That persists. Beyond a few generations, the specific texture of who you are, your particular way of seeing things, the jokes you find funny, the things that move you in ways you can't explain, the specific quality of your attention. When you're really paying it, none of that will be preserved, not in any direct form, not in any archive that anyone will ever read. And yet, some things will persist, not in records, but in people, in the way you changed, in small ways. The people around you who changed, in small ways, the people around them who changed, in small ways, the people around them, on and on, in a ripple that you will never see, because you will be long gone before it reaches its edges, if it has edges, which it may not. This is not consolation. Exactly. It is just a true thing about how influence works in a world where everyone is connected to everyone else through the ordinary human business of living near each other and affecting each other without meaning to, without keeping records, without any intention of being remembered, just by being who you are in the presence of other people who are who they are, and passing it all forward the way it has always been passed forward, without ceremony, without archive, just by living. The scholar who reads the last tablet, an imagined future, somewhere in a future we cannot see, there will be a scholar sitting with the last unread tablet, the last fragment of this ancient world that has not yet been translated. They will do what scholars have always done. They will sit with it for a long time, looking at the marks in the clay, turning it in the light, reading the particular way the reed pressed into the surface, the depth of it, the angle, the slight inconsistency that tells you something about the hand that made it, and slowly, carefully, the way you do a thing that can't be rushed without losing something. They will read it, and whatever it says, whatever ordinary or extraordinary thing it contains, it will arrive in that future moment from this ancient one, carrying whatever it carried across all that distance, and the scholar will sit back and feel what people always feel when a voice from very far away arrive and says something that is still somehow about now, the night that held them all. Every night that ever was, tonight is just one night in an enormous number of nights that have passed since the first people sat outside in the dark and looked up and wondered what was up there and what it meant that they were down here looking at it. Every one of those nights was real. Every person who lay down in the dark, in whatever place they called home, in whatever time they happened to be alive, was as real as you are right now, lying here in your particular dark at the end of your particular day, in the particular year, of this particular moment, in the long story of people being people in a world that is larger than any of them and smaller in some ways than any single person content within themselves. All of those nights, all of those people are somewhere in the history that made this moment possible. Every choice that went right for your ancestors, going back to the very beginning of what a human being is, all of them somehow holding you here in this moment without intending to, without knowing, without any awareness that this is what they were doing just by surviving, just by making it through their night to their morning, and the night after that, and the morning after that, all the way forward. To hear the quiet before sleep takes you, the last few thoughts. There are the thoughts that come just before sleep, the last few before the mind stops making them in any organized way. These thoughts are different from daytime thoughts, less controlled, less purposeful, more willing to go wherever they go without worrying about where they're going. The ancient people had these thoughts too, whatever they were, whatever their versions of the day that needed processing. The worry that softened as wakefulness softened the image from earlier that surfaced again for reasons that made no sense, and then dissolved into whatever comes after images when the mind finally lets them go. This is happening right now for you as it happened for them on their nights, in their houses, in their city that is now a hill in a landscape far from here. The same loosening, the same softening of the grip that the day has on the mind, the same slow relinquishing of the effort of being a person who is awake in managing things and getting things done, the same release into the part of the night where none of that is required, where you can simply be without doing, without managing, without any of it, just breathing in the dark as people have always breathed in the dark for as long as there have been people. The tablet that is this moment, what you are pressing into right now, this moment right now is being pressed into something, not clay, but something. Every moment is, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like it's just passing the way moments do without leaving anything behind. But it isn't. You are changed by every moment you move through, even the ones you don't remember, even the ones that seem to leave no mark at all. The people around you are changed in ways too small to measure by every encounter with you, every word, every silence, every moment in which you were present or not quite present, all of it pressing into the material of the world and the material of the people in it, leaving an impression that you can't see from the inside, but that is real, as real as Marx. In clay, the tablet of this moment is being pressed right now as you listen, as you drift, as you let the day go, as you let the thoughts slow and soften and begin to become something else, something more like dreams than like thinking. You are already halfway there. The body knows what comes next. It is always known. It has been doing this for every night of your life and before your life and before the life before that, back, all the way back to the first night that anyone ever slept, through to the other side of sleep. What waits in the morning will come. It always comes, whatever the night holds, however dark or troubled or long, the morning comes. And the ancient people knew this. They built it into their stories. The sun returning after its journey through the dark, the world restored to light after the darkness that every night required, because night was not nothing to them. Night was a journey that the light took through some other place and came back from every morning without fail. This is still the shape of every night, even now, even knowing what we know about why the sun appears to rise and set, even knowing that it is us turning, not the sun moving still. The night is the time before the morning, and the morning will come. The clay is patient, the river runs, the stars are where they've always been, and you are already past the boundary between waking and the other thing, the soft, formless, ancien, other thing that everyone who has ever lived has crossed into every night and come back from every morning carrying whatever the night gave them into the new day that no one has ever seen before, that no one will ever see again. Yours, just yours, waiting for you on the other side of this, the last words before the quiet takes them. Sleep now. The tablets will wait. They have always waited. They are very good at waiting. Sleep now. The river is doing what rivers do without you. Sleep now. The stars are where they've always been, above the clouds, above the light that hides them, above everything, still there, still the same stars that the ancient astronomers pressed into their tablets on nights like this one, but thousands of years ago. Sleep now. The scholar with the unread tablet is not reading it right now. It will be there tomorrow. Sleep now. The student who drew the animal on the back of their exercise already knew, without knowing they knew, that some things are worth doing just because the moment is there and the hand knows what to do. Sleep now. Your moment is here and your hand knows what to do, which is nothing for now. For the next few hours, nothing. Just the breathing, just the dark, just the ancient, ordinary, extraordinary human business of sleeping through the night and arriving on the other side changed in ways you won't know until you're there. Sleep, the clay is patient, the river runs, the stars are still there, and you are already almost gone into the good dark, the old dark, the dark that has held every sleeping person who ever was, who ever lay down and let the day go and trusted that the morning would come. It will come. It always has. Sleep, you are held by everything that came before you, by every night that was survived, by every morning that was reached, by every ordinary person who lived their ordinary life and passed something forward without knowing what they were passing. You are the arrival point of all of that tonight in this room, in this dark, in this breath, this one and this one and this sleep. The tablets are patient. They have waited 4,000 years. They can wait until morning, and so can everything else. And so can you sleep